Okay, world building cities, architecture, waste disposal systems, if you want, we're going to get to all that. Actually, we're not. I lied. Well, it's kind of a lie, but it is for a good reason. Before that, however, we have to establish one crucial thing. Why are we doing this? I mean, it's a fantastic way to give yourself an aneurysm, so if you're a masochist, then by all means, don't let me stop you. But aside from that, genuinely, what is the purpose? Because that will determine your whole approach to building a city. A city built for a D&D campaign is going to be much different than for a novel. Not entirely, and I'll touch specifically on that difference in a bit. That one is not a lie. But unless you just want to go ham, build the heck out of your city, and then figure out what the hell you want to use it for later, then more power to you. In fact, I'm an enabler. Quit this video and go do that right now. Like, seriously, why are you here? But I'm playing around with a piece that's a kind of travel log, and I've been building a handful of cities because, you know, that's where they travel to. And I can't lie, it's been a grueling experience. Magic in cities out of thin air is hard. You would think I know this as a newly minted urban planner, but no, I had to write novels to figure that out. So I've come up with a few rules to keep my sanity. If they help you, fantastic. Me, I'm trying not to lose my mind. So let's begin. Listen and listen closely. Realism can go and jump off the edge. You do not have to go that deep. This is me sanctioning you if you need it. You can have peace now. Like I said, if it gets you going, go nuts. Build the heck out of your city. But for my preferred style, I approach it like I approach world building as a whole. I do enough to ground myself in the city, which usually involves focusing on the parts that relate to the main narrative, and then do a little fading gradient effect, building the city less and less as it matters. And I love it because in its ideal form, it gives this illusion that there's more than what meets the eye without having to go as deep. Kind of like things disappearing into the horizon. You don't doubt that there's more of the planet Earth beyond that, but it's not currently in your perception if a tree falls in the forest and all that. Except I'm the writer and I completely determine what the perception is, so I decide to go easy on myself and not spend decades building the entirety of Middle Earth Token, you madman. But to be clear, I do enjoy the process, which might honestly be the problem. And so I find myself going deeper and deeper to the point where it's excessive and I'm thinking about waste disposal for a city in the sky. Like, who the hell needs to know all this? Put your hand down, you're the exception. World builder's disease, it comes for one and all. It might not even be an ailment depending on where you stand, which is fair, but I actually want to get to the part where I write the story because, you know, I like that part too. And I'm usually good about catching myself on this, but it didn't click this time because there was this disconnect. Cities feel more contained. You know, the term world building itself implies such a massive undertaking, but cities are just this tiny little corner of it, so surely there would be no problem building it out exhaustively, right? World building is as deep as you make it. Sounds obvious, but I like to talk about the difference between knowing something versus internalizing it. And more than that, executing. One begets the other, begets the other. But this was one of those internalizing moments for me. I think what really made it sink in was the fact that this is a travelogue story, like I mentioned, with several stops in several different cities, each with their own distinct vibe. It left me plenty of chances to fall into this honey trap. Hey, you learn by doing. But remember the bit in the beginning where I mentioned purpose? Yeah, that kind of comes in two parts. We'll start with the purpose of medium. And I mean medium as in forms of storytelling. And this was another one of those internalizing moments. Like, I see world building for different mediums. I study world building for different mediums. But the way people actively vocalize what specifically they were trying to do with their world in my comment section is what really made the difference. And that's part of what I love about doing this. Having people talk about world building for a video game versus a tabletop RPG highlighted the strengths and weaknesses of my own preferred medium and how I can integrate some of the different parts of their process. But the approach is going to be different for each one, and they'll all have different areas of specialization as well. World building a city to world build is its own thing, but if you're building one for a tabletop RPG, you might want to focus more on the consequences your player characters can wreak, which could mean building the city a little looser because you can't account for all their BS. You know, more vague lore than concrete world building. A video game might want to focus more on the interactivity of the city, so quick factoids ready to go or something of that nature. But films, comics, animation, visual mediums in general might have atmosphere and vibes as the front runner. Surprise, it's all subjective, and I think the real fun is in understanding the strengths of your medium as well as your intent and finding the perfect melding point for those two. However, the medium that's got me descending into madness is written prose. Help me. And it brings me to the second half of purpose, narrative purpose. You should have seen this coming. I'm a sucker for the narrative element. And since world building stuff in general tends to be in the background for stories, it's about how much the city affects that narrative. And that decision lies in the hands of the storyteller, whether the city is more of a backdrop or more of a character. So, in the practice of conscious decision making, it becomes a matter of figuring out the determinants of either. Oh, would you look at that? Yet another spectrum that is immutable fact and totally not some arbitrary thing I came up with to serve my own writing. This came about again because of that travelogue aspect. I think it works fantastically for independent cities as well, but characters spend varying amount of time in different cities. Sometimes it doesn't matter where they are on the grander scale because all of the conflict takes place in a tiny space. Sometimes there's more of a focus on character struggles, sometimes we're only there for a chapter. But the city won't always have the same impact, and I needed to make that make sense in here. Hence, this. Okay, so this comes in part, and stay with me because it's kind of a lot, but it all starts with that spectrum I mentioned, and it's a scale from influential to non-influential. What are we influencing? Good question. The plot and the immediate narrative, but not the story as a whole. I'll explain that part in a minute. But let's break the spectrum into 3 chunks to be a little bit more digestible. This section of the scale we'll call passive influence, and it's most likely a backdrop city, more a setting that doesn't really play much of a role other than, hey, this is where the characters exist. It doesn't really impact the plot in any significant way, but it still might affect the story as a whole. Again, we'll get to that part. In this section though, the characters may reference the city in passing, mostly to ground the reader in space, or orient them with some sense of location, but that's only true for the extreme end. As we move further along, the city gains a little bit more influence. Not quite playing an active role yet, but it brings a presence with it. Our awareness of it increases, the atmosphere, the mood behind it. And that mood could serve to mirror the main characters, juxtapose them, details that are more for immersion than affecting any part of the plot, pushing and playing with themes, passive influence. But the next third of the spectrum is where we start to enter the sphere of direct influence on the story, and things really get interesting. By its implication, we start to interact directly with the plot or the narrative, which for a city is usually going to appear in the form of external conflict, like a city's social class or its challenging geography. At this stage though, the city still has limited influence on the plot, which simply means there are only so many aspects of it that can be interacted with. As the story is crafted, these conflict hotspots for interaction will naturally jump out at you. District 12 from the Hunger Games is actually perfect for this. A very dystopian and political story paired with this severely oppressive place that is characterized by poverty, hunger, and a daily struggle to survive, which directly influences Katniss's ability to make it further in the games. But the city also actively creates the inciting incident of the plot, and kickstarts her journey as his sister is chosen in the reaping. You could argue that it's the character of Elfie and not the city itself, and that argument will be made later. But in this moment, Elfie is the city. She is the oppression that permeates every aspect of their daily life, and it has come for one of the few things Katniss holds dear. The capital also achieves the same effect, just under a different mask. And to go back to the spectrum, both those cities on their own don't have quite enough influence to get it to the next section. Gotham is another great example. It can really fall anywhere on the spectrum depending on the iteration of whoever's writing that issue. For the most part though, its interaction is focused on the corruption and crime of Gotham, because Batman, those are the aspects of the city that is influencing the plot. It's never a simple nightclub, instead it's a front for a drug operation. It's not politics, it's crime lords vying for control. Most things that I've revealed about the city end up relating to the fact that Bruce probably needs to break a few bones. I've done a whole video on external conflict where I dive into the concept a lot more if you want to check it out. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. It could be a non-antagonistic plot device where the different aspects of the city could play a significant role, facilitating character interactions, creating an environment for growth. If you really get your gears turning, there's a lot you can do with this. But this side of the spectrum is where a lot of speculative cities start to enter the chat. My personal philosophy on why that is comes in 2 parts. 1, the genre. Fantasy is defined by its otherworldliness. It is a feature. You're reading the genre and you expect some fundamental difference from the real world, and you expect that difference to be explored to some extent. The extent varies depending on the subgenre. The second part of that philosophy is that sci-fantasy writers tend to have all this lore that they created and they simply want to share it. But there's also a story involved, not just lore, and because they want to share it, they make it have narrative significance, shifting this fictional city more towards becoming an active player in the story, which kind of applies to world building as a whole, to be honest. It probably should be ordered the opposite way of narrative significance informing lore, but who's going to stop us? The end result is still the same anyway. It's more a matter of process. But shifting to the third section of the spectrum, we enter active influence. Here, there is such a heavy impact on the plot, and not only that, constant impact, and to such a degree that it might as well be another character, might even undergo a character arc. It is as much about that location as it is any other aspect of the plot. It separates itself from the previous section of the spectrum simply by frequency. Also remember, this is totally not an arbitrary thing created to facilitate my own writing, immutable fact. But in the previous section, it's usually just one or two significant characteristics that affect the narrative, like the crime in the Gotham example. Here though, the city is a living, breathing organism. We get a more rounded three-dimensional perspective, and several aspects of it are going to be affecting the narrative. In the same way, a character may have several wants and needs pulling them a myriad of different directions. I might have created this whole spectrum thing for a travel log, but for cities in this section, we tend to spend a lot of time there, simply by the nature of its impact. You'll probably see a lot of personification in the form of characters saying this city all dramatic-like.
The city's eating itself.
This city's gonna respect us.
This city's afraid of me.
I showed Arcane in that clip, so let's dive into it. It's a fantastic example of a city with heavy influence. Piltover is far from a backdrop city, and it shapes the plot through several aspects. And not just lightly, these aspects affect the plot significantly, and there's a constant interweaving of them with the main narrative. A lot of it is framed in the lens of the undercity of Zon versus topside Piltover, because that's kind of the major overarching plot, the city splitting apart. There is the political aspect, with one side trying to gain its independence and the other side not relinquishing control. Environmental degradation in Zon versus the relatively healthy Piltover. There is the class structure with the rich topside and the poor undercity. The culture with vibrant, uninhibited Zon versus the controlled, measured progress of Piltover. Same descriptors could be applied to the crime. But again, it is about that effect on the plot. Everything I mentioned has a significant effect on the narrative, shifting it further down the spectrum. Now that I'm satisfied with, this isn't right. Something felt off for the longest time when I was coming up with this. It felt incomplete, and I agreed to that feeling, but I couldn't figure out why. So I kind of lost it for a few days. I studied a few more stories with cities that really stood out to me. I tried to understand what the author was doing, tried to see if it was working or not working, and I tried placing them on the spectrum in its correct form, but none of it was really clicking the way I'd like it to, or rather the way I felt it should. So I was left with an unfinished classification, and my headache hadn't been alleviated. My sanity wasting away bit by bit. Until it did click. So for some videos, I'll start with a pseudo outline where I'm kind of figuring out the structure of it and if some parts of it are viable or not, which is especially helpful if I'm still exploring the idea, like in this case. So I'll have some parts of it scripted out in full just to see how it can be delivered. And I caught it in this phrase I used as a descriptor: a living, breathing organism. There are plenty of stories that made me feel that way about a city. A lived-in three-dimensional landscape, yet it had little or no significant influence on the narrative. However, I only applied that descriptor to the final section of the spectrum. So there was another sliding scale lurking in the shadows, and it moves independently of the other one, which simply means we can graph it. Nobody expects a secret y-axis. Deja vu, anyone? But this axis is about interactivity. This is what I said I'd circle back to when I was talking about the impact of a city on the immediate narrative and the plot, as opposed to the overall story. How much the city interacts with the story is not dependent on the impact it has on the narrative, except it feels like it's dependent because a lot of stories have that tendency. And I think that's why I merged the two axes at first, because it's what I see more of. I do have to warn about something though. Actually, it's two something. I think it's better if I show you. So we have our graph with the multiple axes, interactive to impersonal, passive to active influence. Here is pretty common. It has a lot of influence on the plot, shows up and interacts with the story also very frequently, might as well be another character. Absolute win-win in my book. But we've already established that level of depth can't always be the case, because that was part of what was driving me insane. However, remember when I said a lot of speculative cities use narrative significance to facilitate that lore? Yet this is where that sits. It's Arcane that I just went on a whole tirade about. On the opposite side, it's pretty clear what happens, at least on the extreme end. Influence is way less relevant to the narrative, no interaction with the story as a whole. A very impersonal city might as well not exist at this point because it doesn't matter. It has no bearing on anything, which is kind of counterintuitive to the entire point of this video, however, only completely at the extreme end. Other points in this quadrant might be a slightly different story, but by and large, the city still has no major relevance. And if it is doing any influencing on the main narrative, it is purely through vibes vibes, and I will not explain that any other way. But here comes the two things I mentioned before as a warning, and it's the remaining two quadrants. Things get tricky in terms of execution, I mean. Because on this side, we have the city showing up a lot, but having little bearing on the narrative and plot, and that just feels like the definition of filler, which is why I say it depends on execution. That filler trap is definitely something to be aware of, but a deft hand could depict it as an expansive city that lives outside the main narrative, something that supports it rather than overwhelms it. I mean, preferences differ. I for one appreciate that style very much when it's done well, but some people will still see it as filler no matter how well executed. I give you a sample of poisons. Choose one. But it's also why the previous iteration of the spectrum felt off to me. I was ignoring that entire quadrant simply because I'd categorized it as bad writing due to that filler trap. In this graph, the previous spectrum would be a diagonal line with interactivity and impact being one and the same. Bottom line though, a city in the style of this quadrant is deceptively difficult. Knowing what you're trying to achieve, however, is at least part of the way, and that kind of goes for everything writing, to be honest. Here is also murky waters, where this quadrant has the massive pitfall of potential lore dump. This deals with the issue of contrivance. A city that has heavy influence on the narrative, but also not as much interaction with the story as a whole, which means almost every interaction we do get with the city is probably going to be serving a purpose for the plot, and it could easily feel underdeveloped and two-dimensional. Again, deja vu, but I can't think of any reason for a city to be here intentionally. If you have any ideas, feel free to share, but it's mostly because it just bleeds upwards of the graph. Like, if you're going to build a city in this style with significant influence, might as well just add personality and flesh it out a bit more with frequent interactions. A good example might actually be the Hunger Games cities that I mentioned earlier, where it doesn't necessarily feel contrived, but everything that is revealed about them exists towards that goal of elevating one class at the cost of the other, which is a huge part of the plot. The level of oppression the capital deals out kind of gives way for everything to lead back to that class divide, so it's not so implausible that it feels contrived and pulls you out of the story. Same thing with Gotham, we're following a crime fighter, so small wonder why everything about the city relates back to crime. Now, how it differs from Arcane is, like I mentioned before, frequency. The city is just more of a character here, we explore the depths of it, whereas Hunger Games gives way to the games. But apart from that, back to the graph as a whole, if you're dealing with multiple cities, you can do different styles in the same piece. It's great diversity. Now, if plotting cities on a coordinate graph is not quite your speed and it sounds like an overcomplication of a simple concept, first of all, how dare you? Respect the graph. Second of all, yeah, it is too much. A lot of it is actually just intuition and figuring out what works in the moment, not plotting curves on a graph and putting down equations. I mean, we're writing here. Whatever works, works as long as it works. It's something I tell myself a lot. But I think it just comes down to me and how I like to conceptualize writing. Ideas about the craft simply make more sense to me when they have a label, when they've been classified in some sort of way, which is kind of why this video exists, actually. Sometimes the classification even comes first, and it leads me to new avenues of writing I never thought about before. Study your process, I swear it's important. Also, I didn't film much of the graph because I wanted to see how you guys would populate it. And if you want a more streamlined version of this topic that you can just sift through at your leisure, there are Word documents on my Patreon. And my next upload on tech systems or magic systems is also on there if you want to check it out. You guys make this infinitely better. Thank you. Also, you, on my memes here, you know who you are. Why? But there are aspects I've been ignoring about this whole city building thing. You can probably already tell that my natural inclination is towards the top right side of the graph. I like my cities better when they play a more active role. But doing that in prose involves a few things. You know what? I have the perfect person to explain.
I've been summoned. Inka has been talking about the more overarching sociological and narrative aspects of a city. And of course, writers need to have this bird's eye view. They need to understand their cities holistically so that they can portray the kind of explosive diversity that a city has to offer, even in real life. But characters don't experience a city like that. Characters don't perceive cities as whole organisms. They only get to see a little part of it at any given time. It's a more personal and psychological experience. So when authors are choosing how to portray the relationship between a character and a place, they need to pick the details the character pays attention to, and those details will represent the bigger relationship. Perhaps the character stares at the stained glass windows above, disgusted by their opulence. Or maybe they're committed to the memory of a tree that used to adorn a public square in their younger years. Or mayhaps they find themselves restless and trapped when inside the city walls, instead of protected like they ought to. That's the beauty of writing, is picking the right metaphor to represent a much bigger and more complex relationship. But instead of giving you random examples, allow me to demonstrate how this can be done masterfully. Let's have a look at Joe Abercrombie's The Blade itself.
"I never thought to see such a thing," muttered Logan. The city was a huge white crescent, stretching all around the wide blue bay, sprawling across many bridges, tiny in the distance, and onto rocky islands in the sea. Here and there, green parks stood out from the confusion of buildings. The thin grey lines of rivers and canals shone in the sun. There were walls too, studded with towers, skirting the distant edge of the city and striking boldly through the jumble of houses. Logan's jaw hung stupidly open. His eyes darted here and there, unable to take in the whole. A vast fortress rose up from within the city, its sheer white walls towering above the carpet of buildings outside, bright sunlight glinting on shining domes within. Logan had never dreamed of a man-made thing so great, so proud, so strong. One tower in particular rose high over all the others, a tapering cluster of smooth, dark pillars seeming to support the very sky.
We see Logan's emotional reaction here, and it does help us contextualize the scene. But he's still interacting with a postcard rather than a location. He's never been to the city of Adua. He's looking at it from a boat. He's yet to be enveloped by it. So what happens when he actually docks, just a few paragraphs later, and starts to establish a real relationship with a real place? What does he pay attention to?
Only in battle had Logan ever been so squashed, hemmed, pressed by other people. It was like a battle here on the docks. The cries, the anger, the crush, the fear and confusion. A battle in which no mercy was shown and which had no end and no winners. Logan was used to the open sky, the air around him, his own company. On the road, when Bayaz and Kwai had ridden close beside him, he'd felt squeezed. Now there were people on every side, pushing, jostling, shouting, hundreds of them, thousands, hundreds of thousands. Could they really all be people? People like him with thoughts and moods and dreams? Faces loomed up and flashed by, surly, anxious, frowning, gone in a sickening whirl of color. Logan swallowed, blinked. His throat was painfully dry, his head spun. Surely this was hell. He knew he deserved to be here, but he didn't remember dying. "Malachus," he hissed desperately. The apprentice looked round. "Stop a moment." Logan pulled at his collar, trying to let some air in. "I can't breathe." Kwai grinned. "It might just be the smell."
See how we went from postcard descriptions to a very personal, visceral experience. See how this is not about the color and shape of the place, but how the place makes the character feel. What not only asks, but demands his attention. This is how people actually interact with cities. Not with the entirety of them, but with one bit at a time. Focusing on this or that detail, and reacting emotionally to them.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Who was that? Oh, that's just Jorium. Oh, you like that little snippet? You're not gonna believe this. He has an entire channel. He makes amazing content and has a horde I highly suggest you start binging. Another point I've been ignoring. Cities aren't independent, unless you're specifically writing one to be. But the interaction between different cities is kind of important. Trade, transport, borders, and a myriad of other things. Geopolitics and relationships can always add a new, intriguing layer, even if it's not the focus. It can be as subtle as a character mentioning how they get those new fancy armor plates from the neighboring city, or how they're borrowing this cooking method that's pretty popular in the south or wherever, kind of taking the form of character perspective that Joria mentioned. But hold that thought for a second and let's ask my favorite writing question. Why? Why does the city exist in the first place? Canonically, not because you decided to build one. Now, do you need 50 years of detailed lore about it? No. especially depending on where in the graph it falls. A one-sentence answer can be more than enough. But cities don't just materialize into space, and even when they kind of do, there's usually still a reason for it. That reason determines a lot. That is an understatement. On the surface, it can determine architecture, transport, fashion, the general aesthetics of the place. And a little deeper, it can also have an effect on resource management, social development, tourism, and the list goes on. A city that evolved out of a war camp is probably going to have great defenses, a very utilitarian, ordered design. In Broken Earth, there are strict laws about how a city should be built. And because of the massive seismic catastrophes that happen quite frequently, a lot of them are built on the ground. But about those reasons, real life has a lot to pull from. I just mentioned a common one, danger and shelter. Another one is the thing we need to consume somewhat regularly to survive, food and water. Access to water is a huge part of how settlements form. How easy is the place to build on? Flat land is usually a prime choice. Did it spring out of trade routes? Is there religious significance to the land? Important resources there? I mean, the gold rush created a decent amount of cities around the world. But there are other great channels on YouTube for this. In case you haven't noticed, I'm not really the nuts and bolts kind of guy. The narrative element above all else. There is such a thing as a little too far, but you can even mix and match different reasons so your city doesn't become one note. The functions of a city can change as well. Maybe that evolved war camp we mentioned is now becoming the fashion hub of the world. How? I don't know. You're creating this, you tell me. And like I said, it dictates how cities interact. Hey, I need this resource from you. Let's make our yearly trip to the religious place. Stuff like that. Actually, you know what? Go watch Slime. It's essentially city building, the anime. It's great for this. But once you have that reason, you can lean into the more speculative side like Broken Earth kind of did. Which leads me to my next point. I mentioned not getting hung up on realism in the beginning, but you can break a lot of rules, like a lot of them, mainly because there aren't any. I use the term very loosely. The rules came from people's preconceived notions of how cities should be, because real life, which I don't think should be completely discounted, but even that is incredibly chaotic. Maybe planning laws are only slightly chaotic, but everything else is pretty much up in the air. If you're not breaking internal consistency, I say go nuts. I like to maneuver around rules simply because I like playing within constraints, and I think it leads me to more awesome stuff. But you can push a city very far, especially on the fantastical side. My previous video is all about that if you want to check it out. But on pushing your city, I also want to mention something I like to call city-states. It's not a huge deal, but it is something interesting to keep in mind. I see a lot of fictional cities that are just in their default state, an unremarkable, mundane place that lacks any sense of activity. It's a lack of motion and conflict. Even an objectively interesting city like a city on the moon or a floating city can fall into this. It's about the dynamism of the place, about it actively being shaped by internal and external forces. Might not always be the case, but if the point is to create a city that is dynamic and vibrant with life, a city being unique simply by its nature might not be enough. And a great way to counter that is showing how its uniqueness is being affected by things happening, motion. Did they discover a new resource and are currently gaining opulence? Is it at the end or beginning of its span? Is it losing a war, winning one, responding to a disaster that just happened, a cultural renaissance, an expansion? Does it suddenly exist in different places in time? I don't freaking know. Get your brain juice flowing. There is this throwaway gag in Invincible where we go to the city Darkwing is from, this Batman parody character, and we find out that the city is in everlasting night because it was cursed. I don't know if it will be expanded upon or it was just a throwaway gag, but I really wanted to know what life in the city was like because of the state it was in. It's a different story if it was already always night, but it wasn't, and that is the point. These things don't have to be the focus, but that motion, that state of some sort of conflict can make for a very interesting backdrop. Again, something to keep in mind, but what do I know? I'm just out here building shit. Check out the Patreon video. It's genuinely one of my favorites so far. But now I disappear into my hermit hole until further notice. Okay, bye.